Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that has outlasted 2 sitting prime ministers. And how are you, Rob?
I'm very well. Maybe better than I usually am, because of course we're going to be talking about momentous events, historic events. The history books will have to be rewritten, as Spartacus Mills says in that Day-to-Day clip that you shared. Yeah. No, I'm feeling well. How are you? How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm feeling a little under the weather. I'm hoping it's not COVID, but for people who listen to our Patreon bonus episodes, there's a bit more info there. I think, though, today we kind of just have to get on into the news, don't we? Because it's live. Oh, we're coming to you live from bedrooms across the land. Or, well, I mean, actually, you record in your office, as do I. So this isn't like peak COVID where people were, hiding under blankets and stuff to record in weird rooms. And audio quality was always changing. This is our normal setup. So, yeah, I think we should just move on into it. So, first up, the headlines. You might see a theme. I wonder what links them all together, everyone. From the Times, there was Johnson on the brink. From the Daily Mail, can even Boris, the greased piglet, wriggle out of this? From the Telegraph, Johnson hanging by a thread as Sunak and Javid walk out. In the Financial Times, Johnson on brink as ministers quit. Don't know why I did that in that voice, but we're going with it. Daily Express, Boris fights on, declaring I'm now free to cut taxes. The Guardian, PM on the brink after Javid and Sunak quit, which is just a normal headline. The Metro, ministers in a pincher movement, going, gone, which is quite good from the Metro. Thank you. The Eye, Endgame. The Sun, Last Chance Saloon. The Mirror, finally, just in one word, with pictures of some resigning ministers. And the Daily Star, which always wins the Bad Photoshop Award. Cabinet ministers desert Pinocchio. Curtains for Bozo. So that was 2 days ago. I think you can guess the theme. And then in the last day or so, the other headlines, we're just going to go through them again. So the Times, Johnson throws in the towel. The Guardian, it's almost over. The Financial Times, Johnson quits, defiant to the end. The Daily Telegraph, PM's long goodbye leaves UK in state of paralysis. The Eye just goes for downfall, which I'm not sure if that's meant to be an intentional reference to the movie about Hitler. But if it is, well done. The Metro, going for leave means leave, which is very good. Daily Express, thank you, Boris. You gave Britain back its freedom. I think you can tell whose side they're on. The Mirror, clinging on for one last party, which I'm sure we'll get to in a minute. The Mail, what the hell have they done? With a little small red box that says, Day Tories lost their marbles. The Sun, kiss goodbye. And thanks for Brexit, Boris. So again, kind of a half and half one there. And then I think it's the one I shared today. BoJo, that legacy in full from the Daily Star, which is a list of 35 items and only 3 of them have been filled in. Got a cute dog, good party organizer, nice wallpaper, which made me chuckle this morning when I saw that on the way into work. So bit of a theme. What's happened since? So when we last spoke, I think we actually, the lost episode is unfortunately about the vote of no confidence. So I guess we might be slightly going over some topics we've already covered. But for anyone paying attention to UK news, you can't have missed the fact that Boris had a vote of no confidence in him from the Conservative Party that he won back at the start of June. And now what's happened since then? Oh, I mean, let's just touch on that vote of no confidence, just in case our listeners aren't up to speed. But I feel anyone with a passing interest in British politics probably knows the core details.
I thought I would just touch on the vote of no confidence for a while, because clearly, like, those papers are saying Boris Johnson has gone. You'd have to have lived under a rock to not realise that fact. But it's been something that's been slowly bubbling up for about a month. And in a way, I'm quite glad that the lost episode never made its way out, or that we did have the recording. Because imagine if we'd released it on Wednesday this week, it would very, very quickly go out of date, which is why I'm quite glad that we're doing this one live as it is. So, yeah, just to sort of remind listeners about what was happening about a month ago, that was Boris Johnson's last crisis, which was kind of about the remnants of Partygate and how he apologised for Partygate, and essentially MPs within the party not being satisfied with his version of events or what he presented to the general public. They didn't think his apology was enough. They'd waited for the Sue Gray report. They'd waited for the police to have their findings. And still after that, a significant majority of Tory MPs decided that they weren't convinced enough, and in went the letters to the 1922 committee. 54 of them, I believe, was needed to trigger a vote. And that vote happened at the start of June. It was a vote that Boris Johnson won, but only with 59% of his party supporting him and the other 41% against, which I think showed quite a clear divide in the party, and showed that, that feeling towards Boris was certainly quite anti him. he wasn't secure. He would have to do something to change their hearts and minds over the summer. So that was the vote of no confidence, very, very shortened. And I believe we sort of concluded that episode like, how long's Boris going to last? I think we kind of said something along the lines of, I'd be very surprised if he lasted until the end of the year, but I certainly didn't see the downfall coming this quickly. But I think events did move quite fast, and the next point we'll go on about the next scandal just seems like, I don't know if it seems this way to you as well, but I feel every time we've gone on this podcast, we've had a new scandal to cover since about January this year. Like, the pressure on Boris, I don't think he's had like a clear week or a clear month where nothing has gone wrong either for him or for the Conservative Party in general.
No, I mean, I think that's correct. So firstly, the VONC episode that doesn't exist, unfortunately. Maybe I might scan through and see if there's any salvageable audio where you're like, yes, he's going to go.
I predict he'll go on the 7th of July. That's what I said. Yeah. He's been able to defy political gravity before. However, I do feel that this is a time where time is running out for him. If those by-elections continue to go bad, and if he fails to get any major policy advances through Parliament, we could see the end of Boris Johnson by the end of the year, is my guess, because votes of no confidence tend to be pretty terminal for Conservative leaders, and I don't see any evidence really suggesting that that won't be the case for Boris Johnson, no matter what him or his people might say.
Yeah, I mean, I think we were both saying, oh, well, he's on his way out, but he's survived this, and we knew that after the VONC, under the current 1922 rules, which at this point still haven't changed, you have a year where you're safe from a vote of no confidence. But as you pointed out, as the person who remembers all these facts and figures, the reason you're star of the show, Rob, is that that happened to Theresa May as well, and she was gone within, I think it was 3 months of her vote of no confidence that she succeeded in winning. So there are other ways for a Prime Minister to leave. Basically, the general way is they're told to resign by their cabinet, and they accept that and carry on and leave, and they hand over. And we're going to talk about various bits where Boris is not following the traditional route here when we move on in a second. But I don't think I have much more to say on the VONC itself. I guess as we move into the next section, what was it that got him, given, as you say, scandal after scandal, and like a duck, water off his back, it seemed. He seemed fine. He would bluster and blah, blah, blah. His polls would take a bit of a beating, but he still managed to be surviving. I mean, he lost a few by-elections, but he still had this gigantic majority. This gigantic majority, which meant he wasn't really, as far as I could see, having any issues with, keeping his party in line and doing, he was like, look at me, I am the party, was almost what he was saying in a kind of Trumpian way. So what toppled him? So
oddly enough, it was the surprise resignation of his deputy chief whip, Chris Pincher, for something that Pincher had done that at first seemed quite isolated to Boris Johnson. So he resigned because he'd gone to the Carlton Club, he'd drank too much, and in doing so, it was said that he acted inappropriately around two of the male members of staff, or male people who were at the club that night. A lot of people have witnessed it. He clearly saw that there was no way that he was going to come back from it, so resigned from the party immediately. So at first glance, I think that seems like, oh, that's another scandal for the Conservative Party, along the lines of the porn-watching MP, or David Warburton, who's in the neighbouring constituencies, where I live, where he'd done drugs. At first glance, it looked like, oh, the Conservatives are a party of sleaze, but that's not necessarily related to Boris Johnson. However, things started to come out where basically they said, okay, Mr. Pincher's been accused of this, and it looks like he's been accused of similar things in the past. Did the Prime Minister know this when he appointed him to the position of Deputy Chief Whip? A position he'd only risen to recently, and I think about January, February of this year, because Christopher Pincher was one of the whips that was vital in Boris Johnson's mind for getting the party together in the wake of Partygate, that first round of scandal that happened in January, February of this year. Mr. Pincher was one that rallied the party around and said, no, you've got to wait. We don't remove Boris now. We're going to make sure that he stays in. So people started to question this line of thought, and The line from number 10 was, no, Boris knew nothing about this. Okay, fine. Out the ministers go on the interviews, on all of those morning interviews you see on Sky, on the BBC, on Radio 4, with that line in their pocket that when people asked them, no, the Prime Minister, of course, knew nothing. The next day, things started to change. And they went, oh, the Prime Minister didn't know of any specific allegations, which is a weird thing to say. This is because you had leaks from people like Dominic Cummings, who suggested that the Prime Minister did know. The phrase that was going around a lot was that the Prime Minister had referred to Chris Pincher as Pincher by name, Pincher by nature, which is a bit disturbing that when you consider, Boris Johnson essentially knew that this man had groped people in the past, and if he had that in his mind when he appointed him as Deputy Chief Whip, a position that is sort of responsible for people coming towards them if they've got complaints about other MPs, they're meant to be a safe space for that. If the person in charge of that is also somebody who's got allegations of groping behind them, that's a very bad look for the party and clearly is a bad, it's a stain on Boris Johnson's judgment of what he decides is important when you employ somebody along those lines. So that was the line the day after. Then it emerged that Christopher Pincher, while he'd been working at the Foreign Office, had had a complaint against him upheld from an unnamed member of staff or perhaps an MP. That the victim of this assault didn't want to sort of press any charges or go further with the complaint at all. So there was no sort of formal action taken against Mr. Pincher, but it was a complaint that was upheld. So it was clear that Mr. Pincher had done something in the wrong. But the government up to this stage was still saying that Boris Johnson had no idea about this complaint. He didn't. Then you've got Tuesday morning, a member of the civil service, Lord MacDonald, breaks cover. And I think this is very significant because usually the role of a civil servant is to stay out of politics altogether. They are meant to be the silent people working in the background. No matter which government is in charge, you put your head down and you do your job and you serve the government of the day. I mean, Lord MacDonald clearly felt that he couldn't do that anymore because, as he said in his own words, he felt that the story number 10 giving was not an accurate representation of events. And he was able to say, look, Boris Johnson very clearly was given examples of a specific allegation, namely this one from the Foreign Office, and this was presented to him as something that he had to consider when he appointed him to Deputy Chief Whip. And it was later discussed by Dominic Raab on the morning round of interviews on Tuesday that Mr. Pincher's appointment had gone through an ethics committee and they decided that there was nothing wrong and that he could continue in that role. Finally, you get there's an emergency question on standards in public life that happened at Tuesday at about 12:30. And oddly enough, I started to see that things were bubbling up and I decided, I'll sit down and watch this because I feel it might be a bit spicy. Like, I've got a bit of the vibes of Partygate going on here about how the government has continuously misled the public and its own ministers with a story. Like, the story is slowly changing each day as more facts are leaked out that they didn't want to leak out in the first place. And the Paymaster General, Michael Ellis, goes up to the stand and gives Boris's great defence, which is essentially, yes, Boris Johnson was aware of allegations, but he just forgot about them. That's why we told you that story in the first place, that he didn't know anything, but he's remembered now, and we're here to tell you that there were. But it's still fine, because even though a complaint was upheld for Mr. Pincher, like, the law hasn't got involved yet. Therefore, Boris Johnson was kind of fine doing what he did. It was if you think the argument I'm putting across is like really weak, it's because that's how weak it was from the government. I do think it was an extraordinarily weak point of view to try and get across and defend your position. So you get to that point, people aren't taking the bait. Boris Johnson decides that he has to set the record straight himself and do one of his apologies where he says, I'm ever so humble, I'm sorry, I've learned from my mistakes, I'll do better next time. That goes out about 6 o'clock, and then at about 6:05, and then 10 minutes later, about 6:15, boom, boom, you get the resignation of Sajid Javid, the health secretary, and then Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And all of a sudden, anything seems possible. And that's when text started to go around to saying, do we record tonight? Is things happening? And I think that the mood suddenly changed in that instance that, can Boris Johnson recover from this when he loses two cabinet ministers, two very senior cabinet ministers? Very, very quick.
I think we've definitely kind of fallen into a kind of continuing theme of, like you say, we had all these scandals, and we were just, every episode there'd be some kind of Boris scandal. It wouldn't be our focus because there were just so many of them. And then suddenly on a in that moment everything switches, and I was like, do we need to do the emergency episode now? Very reminiscent of various parts in the Brexit process where we had a number of live listeners, which was always fun. So thank you to everyone who's joined to listen today, and I'll just put the quick plug here that there's a link to the Discord in the show notes that's there every time if you want to come along and listen live. That's, you don't have to be a patron for that. It's just a free thing. You just have to join the server and listen as we record, but we don't always like tag every single episode like we used to do back during the Brexit days. I just wanted to mention on this, I can't remember if this was in a Patreon bonus or something I mentioned as part of the main course of the podcast a few months back. I listened to a audiobook called Haven't You Heard, which is written by someone who used to work in Westminster and gave various details about scandals and stuff based on their time in Westminster. One of the takeaways I got from that is there's a very old newsletter called Pop Bitch that you can sign up for. I'm hoping that that's the name of the thing and therefore not going to get us in trouble with the iTunes gods. But yeah, so that newsletter I signed up to because it's basically gossip and rumor. A lot of it is celebrity focused, but there's always a bit of UK politics in there, and they have pretty good sources, and they're trying to at the moment get people to sign up for a paid membership scheme. So they'll often ask you like a question and they won't reveal the answer for a few weeks, and it's like, if you want to reveal the answer, subscribe and you can see the answer, and it'll always be like, oh, which minister, which politician, or which celebrity has done X recently, and then it'll come out. And I just need to read out the one that got revealed today before we recorded, which is very handy. So the question a couple of weeks ago they asked was, which Tory MP once lured a parliamentary intern back to his house for what turned out to be an unexpected seduction attempt with the promise of din-dins south of the river? And the answer, it turns out, was Chris Pincher. So you can see they have a bit of an inside track. They get some rumors, and it's weird that a thing I read 2 weeks ago and went, oh, that sounds disgusting, like as a turn of phrase, and I was just like, bleh. And I just kind of dismissed it, and then that's the thing that gets Boris.
Yeah. Well, I think, and apologies, one of the listeners in the chat has already heard this explanation from me last night when I was talking about it casually. But I do think one of the reasons that this scandal hit a bit harder than others that have gone for Boris. So if we talked about others in the past where it's like, Wallpapergate, that's misuse of public funds. It's bad, but maybe some people would defend that Boris Johnson has allowed nice wallpaper because he's the Prime Minister. Okay, it's not a very popular argument, but it doesn't seem like the end of the world. Partygate was clearly very controversial because Boris Johnson is the man who is meant to set the rules for COVID. He's meant to be the example. Him breaking his own rules did seem very hypocritical, but the fact that he got fined over essentially having a birthday cake, I think, and the fact that COVID was that topic, that issue of the rules was quite divisive in the general public. There are a lot of people who feel that the COVID rules were too strict or too draconian and feel that Boris Johnson should have been allowed a bit of chocolate cake on his birthday and he shouldn't have been fined for that. That's still an issue where I think the general public and maybe MPs can excuse him a little bit or see that it's a little relatable. When it comes to issues of inappropriate conduct within the House of Commons amongst your own MPs, there is not one MP who's going to be on the side of Chris Pincher for this argument. Like, it is inexcusable. It's indefensible, right? And it seems like a very clear moral and ethical choice not to have that person in charge of, to be allowed that kind of close access to MPs or be in a role that senior. It should be a pretty easy decision for somebody to make to get them out of your cabinet. And the fact that Boris Johnson appeared to know of this, ignore it, and then willingly appoint him to a high level of government shows that it seemed clear to people that Boris Johnson was putting loyalty before anything else. That combined with the fact that you'd had that slow changing of the story within Downing Street, the truth once again had to be pulled out, and that ministers sent on TV were made to look like fools. People who had come out and given one version of the story were now being told it's entirely incorrect. I mean, on the day before the news broke that Boris Johnson knew anything about this, there were no senior ministers on the morning programmes. There were only junior ministers, and the suspicion was from people in the know that was because none of the big ministers were willing to put their names to Number 10's story. It had to be a junior minister who could be thrown under the bus this time. So, yeah, I think if you're looking for a reason why this was the one that triggered this strong reaction from the cabinet and from Conservative MPs. For me, that's the biggest reason why, because what Chris Pincher did and then what Boris Johnson did as a result is indefensible, and I think it's the ultimate example of defending the indefensible.
I think there's probably quite a few things people would have claimed before were indefensible that he did anyway. And one thing that I don't think you've mentioned directly that came up on a number of podcasts I listened to, specifically Newscast, which did a number of very short notice episodes with Chris Mason, the BBC political commentator who replaced Laura Kuenssberg. They were talking about how part of the problem as well is that the level of whip he was. He's basically meant to be like a spiritual leader kind of the party. He's meant to be someone that people can turn to in confidence when they have problems come up, or say, oh, hey, this thing happened. I'm going to have to tell the press or something because it will come out eventually. Or in other cases, hey, something bad happened to me and you need to deal with it. And you can't really have someone in that position who is breaking the equivalent moral norms, because then no one would trust them and go to them. And so that is another reason why MPs particularly might be like, okay, this is a step too far, even though to us as outsiders, it might seem a bit like, oh, is that the thing that turned, like, given the other kind of scandals that Boris has ploughed through, it did seem a bit like, oh, really? That's the thing that's caused it, to fall apart, which, I was a bit surprised by. You mentioned there were 2 resignations. So we had 2 in quick succession, the Chancellor and the Health Secretary. And that was, as we said, what made us go, ooh, something's happening here. The next day was definitely an interesting PMQs. And I think we were all glued to it, as you alluded to at the start, spending the last few days glued to the BBC News 24. So what happened? Yeah, there was PMQs. Javid got up and gave a speech during at the end of PMQs, and then there was a load of other stuff during the day, during which Boris was actually kind of secluded from all the stuff that was going on the news. So yeah, do you want to fill us in on that, Rob?
Yeah. So we've moved from the 2 big resignations at the end of Wednesday, and there's like a small trickle of people. I think there's about like 8 people who've resigned by the end of the day, 2 big cabinet ministers and other PPSs, which you will hear a lot about, but they're personal private secretaries. I think they are, for a government to function, you need about like 160, 180 people just to run all the ministerial departments. And the MPs have various levels of like roles and commitments. So 10 have leaked away. Obviously not a good sign for Johnson, but he can replace them. So Johnson replaces Javid and Rishi Sunak rather quickly. Probably the most significant change is that Zahawi, who was the education secretary, he was formerly the minister for vaccines. So he got, vaccines is seen as one of the things that Boris Johnson's government did quite well. So he's held in quite high regard. He did that, hopped along to education, and then moved on to be the Chancellor. He went on all the morning programmes with, hello, I'm your new Chancellor, nothing to see here. I'm going to be a better Chancellor than that old rubbish bloke who kept raising your taxes. We're going to cut them all for you. But while he's giving his interviews, more people are resigning. Like, there was a beautiful moment on Radio 4 where he's talking and Nick Robinson says, sorry, this person's just resigned. What did you think of them? Oh, I'm very sorry to lose them from the cabinet. Okay, blah, blah, blah. Goes on his little speech. And then Nick Robinson says, oh, and this other person's resigned whilst you're having this conversation as well. So the thing is falling apart before our eyes, but Johnson still wants to go ahead to PMQs. And you have a trickle of resignations and what appears to be like every 40 minutes, half an hour up to actual PMQs himself. Everybody's waiting for what Keir Starmer has to do. And I think I've been quite rightly quite critical of the way Keir Starmer's conducted himself in PMQs lately, particularly the one after the vote of no confidence, where I felt he really failed to land a blow on Johnson at all. In this one, he really focused on the allegations of sexual assault against Mr. Pincher, used his previous experience as director of public prosecutions to sort of say what happens to victims in this situation and how horrible it is. And, Boris Johnson, how can you let these things happen? Johnson's response to this was expected, but entirely insufficient. He essentially went back to the same old rote stuff he's been doing for the past few months, which is vaccine rollout, our economy's the best in the G7. If we'd listened to Keir Starmer, we'd be living under Jeremy Corbyn right now, which isn't really what I think the Conservative Party wanted to hear. And the noise from the benches behind him was noticeably muted. He wasn't getting the support that he wanted. The other thing that was stark is usually in PMQs, the flow goes, okay, the Prime Minister is going to get bashed by Labour for a while, that's fine, you expect it, and then somebody from the Conservative benches will stand up and say, hello, Mr. Johnson, you're wonderful, aren't you? Will you tell me how wonderful you really are? And then, like, he's boisted, he's pumped up for a while and he feels good. Instead, he was just having a barrage of criticism from people on the back benches of his own party. One of them said, are there any circumstances under which you would resign? And Johnson danced around that question, basically saying, if I found it impossible to help the people of Ukraine, maybe I'd resign, but I'm not going to do that. Gary Sandbrook, who's a member of the 1922 committee and is from the meme. I don't know if you've seen the graffiti. Gary Sandbrook likes big dinners or eats big dinners.
Have. Yes.
Yeah. He's that one, I think, because his criticism of food banks and their use during the time. I think that's why he has that meme there. But he was talking about what the Prime Minister had said to them behind closed doors and seemed to insinuate that Boris Johnson said, if Christopher Pincher was drinking, why didn't some of the MPs at the Carlton Club step in to stop him? And Gary Sandbrook took great offence at that, sort of suggesting that the problem is alcohol rather than Mr. Pincher himself, and that why was it MP's responsibility to stop Mr. Pincher doing stuff that's just horrible and you wouldn't expect a normal human being to do so. Like, Boris Johnson should have stopped him by not hiring him to that role. He shouldn't rely on MPs to stop this gentleman from drinking. So, yeah, another poor response to that question. And Boris Johnson is clearly on the ropes this whole time. And then the most important point happens, and I think it's going to address what we've got a question in the chat therefore, was Sajid Javid's resignation speech. So it is a courtesy allowed to all ministers who've resigned that are allowed to explain the reasons for their resignation to the House. And Javid basically got a prime time slot right after PMQs. He was allowed that by the Speaker to come and say, right, these are the reasons I've resigned. His response, in short, taking the sort of like cliff notes from what he said, was that he's not a quitter. He's a loyal minister. He felt that it was a great privilege to step into the role of health secretary when needed, because clearly after COVID, that's a gap, and the health of the nation is very important, if not even more important after a pandemic. It was clear that position needed to be filled, and he was honoured to fill that position. However, he felt that there had been multiple distractions during the course of government, and he mentioned Partygate and the Sue Gray report, and mentioned how he had obediently towed the party line. He believed what Number 10 had told him. He went out in the interviews and did it. However, when it came to the Christopher Pincher affair, he felt that he could no longer believe what was going on in government, felt that Boris Johnson had apologised or said, right, we're going to hit the reset button again. And in Javid's words, he said that you can only hit the reset button so many times before you realise that something is broken with the system and the man at the top, rather than anything else that's going on. Essentially saying that I believe that Boris Johnson is the problem here, not anybody else in the party. Well, sorry, not others. Yeah, that you can't just keep getting rid of ministers and small little things. Boris Johnson appears to always be at the centre of these things, and he's the reason why we're getting this misinformation out of Number 10. There was also quite like a pointed attack on other ministers, basically saying that, by the way, it's a choice for you to stay and keep supporting Boris. I've finally put my head up above the trenches and decided to resign, and I know how hard it is to make that decision to leave the cabinet altogether, but now's the time to get out, because I fear that we're doing more harm than good by keeping this man in power. So as our questioner in the chat has said, do you think the resignations from people like Javid and Sunak were because of like deeply held like morality, or because they knew that BoJo was on the ropes and this was their time to sort of get their final punch in or declare themselves as potential former leaders? It's a bit of both. I feel genuinely that most MPs aren't bad people, and they get into politics as they have a genuine desire to do good for their country. They might have very different political views to you or I, or have a very different vision of how that's going to be done. But most of them, I don't think, are like Boris and are in it for personal power. I think they are in it to try and do some good. And I believe to an extent when Javid says, look, Javid had already once walked away from Boris Johnson's government when they tried to give him the Chancellor of the Exchequer job under Cummings, but he couldn't agree with the rules that Cummings had set. So that's why we got Sunak as Chancellor, because Javid turned it down and said, no, I can't do it, and walked away from government once before, but clearly felt that as one of the more talented ministers, when he was offered health, he couldn't turn it down because maybe he couldn't bear that role going to somebody who he felt was unqualified for the job. Like, you have people in the cabinet who are there out of loyalty, like Mogg and Nadine Dorries, who I don't personally think are very talented ministers, and I think that shows in a lot of the things they do, the gaffes they do. Like, there's a multiple Nadine Dorries gaffes where I just think if you'd paid attention or if you'd had a modicum of respect for what you're doing, you would be competent. But you're not. You keep doing this, and it's kind of the case with Boris to an extent. He does the same. But yes, Javid clearly, I think, saw that this was the time to go, and the fact that both of those two, I know they came 10 minutes after each other. It is claimed by both parties that wasn't a synchronized event, that they both came to that conclusion of their own accord separately, and those resignations happened to go out one after another. You can believe that all you will, but I do think genuinely for a lot of ministers, they decided it was time to go. And I think Javid knew that it required people of that standing to then start that domino effect. And boy, did we see that domino effect start to go after that. So yeah, I don't know if you've got anything to add on that.
A few things. I just want to say, like, your comment about Nadine Dorries, she's very much, we've all been to a meeting with someone who isn't up to date, and she's that person in every meeting, which is quite impressive. And then Rees-Mogg is like the opposite thing, where, he is fully in, playing someone from the 1800s. There is, I won't put it in the show notes, I'm afraid, but you can go find Dom Jolly swearing at his screen as Rees-Mogg was saying stuff throughout the day, and he was just like, oh, well, other prime ministers have survived things like this. Remember when Salisbury did? And it's just like, yes, a load of old facts from like 60 years ago, very well done, but also, what are you on that you think this is, but that's his persona, and he's, I think, very much intentionally built that up. And as is often reported in Private Eye, allegedly Rees-Mogg, and he definitely made a decent amount of money off Brexit by having the inside track. He can, make shrewd investments and stuff. I think that's the only reason he's there. Yeah, as I say, allegedly, just to cover myself there. But yeah, PMQs, I think we get listeners, especially American listeners, and we've talked a bit about this before, PMQs is very different to what the US president has to deal with. It's normally a bit boring, but yeah, this was definitely one to watch. As you said, people coming up and down from both sides and laying into Boris. Some not surprising, but there's only so many times you can be like, oh, well, I left Brexit, vaccine rollout and stuff like that. It's like, yeah, there's only so much you can do with repeating it. And we've seen this before, and we were like, oh, well, how's he surviving by just saying the same lines over and over again? But I think this time, yeah, with his party also against him, the knife was well and truly twisted. So he came out of PMQs, there was Javid's speech, and then he had to go into a select committee. Well, it's like a committee of committees, isn't it? So at this point, you'd mentioned resignations. At this point, I think, is when BBC turned on we'd been tracking throughout the day a graph which showed general resignations in Parliament over the course of various prime ministers. And you can see people like Blair, who have quite a shallow curve, and Cameron, similarly, like he started to go up near the end, but he left. And then Theresa May had quite a sudden uptick in resignations before she chose to step down. And Boris's graph went vertical at this point as people just all resigning in one day. And the BBC implemented a resignation counter that was on the bottom right of the screens, which I got a screenshot of. So yeah, Boris was, as I said earlier, he was kind of in this committee meeting, which was being streamed live. And I don't think many people, tune in for select committees very often. But what was going on there as these resignations were ticking up, and I think several people mentioned to Boris while he was being questioned, oh, you came in here with this many resignations and now you've got this many a few times.
Yeah, it was the maddest 90 minutes of television I've ever really watched. It tells you a lot about the man himself, I think, because Boris decided to do what Boris has always done, which is come in and kind of just deny that there's a problem. I will get through this by just a complete pig-headedness and avoiding the facts that are going on around me. If I just tell everybody everything's okay, I'll get through this. I mean, I think his response to one of the MPs who asked him a question, which was just, how's your day going, or how's your week going? And his was terrific, which elicited a laugh. But I felt that MP should have drilled down into that question. Like, why is it terrific? Why is this better than your usual days? Because the facts really aren't showing that, Boris. It was genuinely bizarre. There was 90 minutes of a prime minister there answering questions and making like promises to do statements or enforce policies that it was clear that he didn't have a mandate to do, or that he'd be out by the end of the day, because it was just his position was becoming more and more untenable by the second. You mentioned that resignation counter. It was up to like about 32 at the time, trickled up to 35. That was already a high watermark. That was the most amount of ministers that had resigned post-war. With simply numbers that no government can recover from, and people were starting to ask questions like, how can this government function and go on? I've mentioned that like you don't need members of just the cabinet to quit. If you have enough personal private secretaries quitting, there are those among them that there were people in the House on that day, whilst in the Houses of Parliament, whilst Boris Johnson was having that liaison committee, saying we're going to have to cancel some sessions tomorrow because these people have resigned and we've got nobody to replace them with yet. So we can't carry out the function of Parliament. And when it's getting that bad, you just know that the situation, it's untenable. You can't go on. But he just sat there and took it from everyone, like everybody on that committee, because they are split up between members of all parties, but the Conservatives will have a larger number of MPs on those committees than Labour or the SNP, for example. Every Conservative MP there was giving him a hard time or drilling him down on the facts. And the fact that the committee was into standards in public life, something which was of a direct concern on that day, very much linked to the Christopher Pincher affair. Yes, it was bizarre. Boris Johnson's just lack of contrition throughout the whole thing was really stark. And mostly, if you want to talk about what Javid had said earlier about how, like, I can't believe that you will change, Boris Johnson. I don't believe that you are the man to stop this pattern that's been going on these past few months. I think that committee would have absolutely confirmed it for you, because, he didn't do a big apology for what he'd done. He didn't say, I'm really going to get on top of standards life. It was kind of like, I'll keep on doing what I'm doing. I'm the right man for the job. Please just believe in me. Just like if the media would get off my back for a few seconds, I could really do something. If you just believe in me, guys. But it was clear that even his own MPs weren't drinking that Kool-Aid anymore. So yes, extraordinary thing to do. I think that he did it. I think he did PMQs and he did the liaison committee just because if you cancel them, if he doesn't go to it, then that's a crisis. Like, you've got to admit that things aren't normal then. So the way he avoids it is just like pretending everything's fine. No, I'm just going to do my normal diary. I'm going to ignore all these people resigning. If I just do what I normally do, then maybe when I get back to my desk at the end of the day, everything will be fine because I'm acting like it's fine and I'm the leader and they have to follow my rules. But yes, that certainly wasn't the case by the time that committee was over. And as you said, by the resignation tracker that was live on screen, this was not a normal day in politics. And I think everybody at that time, even Boris Johnson, deep down, I think everybody knew it.
I mentioned there was a graph that I was following. It's from the Institute for Government, and the reason I found out about it was in the BBC Live stream. They popped in a BBC-ified version of the graph, source this, and then the BBC graph wasn't updating enough, so I went on a look, and then I found the original source, and then found the guy on Twitter whose job it is to produce this graph, and he was just like, I'm updating this every 10 minutes, I can't go on, which was very funny. And then there was someone live stitching a cross-stitch version of that graph, and when it got to the one I've put in the chat here, and I'll try and make sure I've got a variety of them in the show notes. This one is when Boris was almost he was just about to overtake May at 35 resignations. And this person who'd been cross-stitching was like, he needs to go now because I'm running out of space and I'm running out of thread, because they had enough space for 2 more resignations. And so that was kind of the state of things. And yeah, it's funny looking back on it, because we were all very, I was in several different chats where we were basically live sharing memes and information with each other. And it was a bit of a wild ride. And then Boris went back to number 10 and we were all like, well, he's got to go, right? Gotta go.
Yeah.
So what happened then?
So he goes back to number 10, and I'm thinking around about 8 p.m., 9 p.m., you'll get a what we call a podium moment, as in the podium comes outside and big speech is about to happen. This is the one where he finally sees the writing on the wall. And there were lots of internal reports of Boris Johnson being approached by various ministers of state to tell him that the game is up. So the stories that have been going on through the day was that Michael Gove wasn't there at Prime Minister's questions. He was filmed on his phone outside talking to people. It was alleged that he had gone in and seen Boris Johnson earlier and said that the writing was on the wall. There are reports that lots of cabinet ministers were going in, but rather they didn't do it in a group. They would go in one by one and declare to Boris, okay, I think it's over. Or in the case of people like Nadine Dorries and Jacob Rees-Mogg, say, no, I think you still got this. We'll stick with you if you want to try and stick it out. And this pattern continued through the night. And the longer it went on, the more it was like, oh my goodness, he's digging in. What is he doing? And people are starting to talk now of like a constitutional crisis, because there are ways that you can remove a prime minister. One is through a vote of no confidence, like the whole parliament does it and like triggers and gets rid of him that way. That might trigger a general election, which most people didn't seem keen on, even though the Conservatives aren't polling very well. Labour and the Lib Dems clearly saw it was more beneficial for the Conservative Party to rip themselves apart, rather than the moment you call a general election, the Conservatives are forced to rally behind their leader. That's what happens in general elections. So that would arguably strengthen Boris's position. They weren't going to do that. The other option is that the 1922 committee, which was having a meeting that evening, they could get together and change their own rules and say, okay, I know we said we can't have a vote of no confidence until a year's after the other one, but things are so bad now and it's clear so much the party's against him, it would be untenable for us to try and go on for another 11 months like this. Maybe we should change the rules. In fact, at the 11th hour on Thursday, they decided that they wouldn't change the rules. Instead, they would wait for a new committee to be elected, which would be on the Monday, and then maybe that committee could change the rules instead. So at this stage, we were thinking, could Boris hang on over the weekend maybe, which seemed bizarre. Like the question was how many more people he was going to lose in that time. The noises coming from number 10 were Boris Johnson is going nowhere. That was the official line. That he's got an exciting, that these people who have gone can be replaced. He'll put out an exciting new vision for the country. Denial, but slowly, as I watched like the BBC News feed, it was becoming clear that Boris Johnson wasn't going anywhere on that Thursday night. The two biggest things that happened for the remainder of that night was at 9 o'clock, we got the news that Boris Johnson had sacked Michael Gove.
That was like a bombshell moment. We're like, when he mentioned Gove before, I didn't want to jump in, but just to mention Gove, as we know, has form, because Gove and Boris both were going to go into the leadership election after Theresa May, and then Gove was like near the end of that was like, actually no, I'm going to support Boris, and we were like, oh, well, Boris is going to win now, and then at the last minute he pulled out his support and Theresa May won, so he has form for going against the Prime Minister. So we were like, what is this twist ending?
Yeah, I mean, many people are calling it sort of like revenge for what happened back then. And I think it was fairly petty because as far as internal Conservative Party politics go, firing Michael Gove is probably the last thing you want to do, because whatever your opinion on Michael Gove is, it's a fairly well-known fact within the Conservative Party is that he's an incredibly competent minister, and the portfolios he tends to take charge of, he gets the job done on that. That's, if you ask the question, why is Michael Gove in every cabinet? It's because he's actually incredibly competent as a minister. So to fire him when you've got people leaving of their own accord, left, right, and centre, can only be because of a personal matter, rather than anything that you want to do is to to try and keep your government going. If you wanted to keep the party together, you've got to keep Gove on side, and to sack him would have set ripples through the Conservative Party that just says, okay, Boris has really lost it now. He's got no desire to keep this party together. He's only doing it for his own personal gain. So I thought that was bizarre. The second bizarre thing was that you had, there are maybe two more. You had the new Chancellor of the Exchequer, who'd only been appointed the day before, apparently was one of the ministers going into Boris saying, it's all over, which is a bold statement in itself. Then you've got Suella Braverman, who went on Robert Peston around about 11 o'clock and, under questioning, said openly to Robert Peston, yeah, I'm going to put my hat in to be the new leader of the hat into the ring to be the new leader of the Conservative Party. I don't believe in Boris Johnson. Oh, but I'm still a member of his cabinet, though, and I'll still remain that. And I don't know, to me, it was either her coming out and say, well, why don't you sack me? Or she knew that Boris Johnson was so clearly going to go that she didn't have to resign. She didn't have to make that statement. It was inevitable. But it was quite clear to everyone, maybe apart from Boris Johnson at that stage, that you've effectively got a cabinet in open revolt there. When one of your cabinet ministers is saying, I don't believe that this prime minister is fit to be prime minister, and I'm throwing my hat in the ring to be the next one. Oh, and I'm not resigning from the cabinet because who cares? You've got a completely dysfunctional government. So yeah, that was the big point where at the end of Thursday night, everybody was like, well, I don't know how Boris is going to survive that, but he's still in number 10. Any sensible prime minister would have gone by now. Let's see what tomorrow brings. But people were really starting to worry about full-on constitutional crisis type things because, yeah, it wasn't good.
It becomes clear that Boris isn't going that evening. Like, I was sat at work at about 5 o'clock being like, do I get on the train in the chances that I miss like having a live stream of this, Boris going, that's a big bit of political news. We're going to talk about it on Friday. And so what I did was I was like, and I mentioned it to it, and some people, no, he'll be around a bit longer. I was like, okay, fine. There probably are some chats to be had. And so then I was just watching the news live at home, expecting, as I think a lot of people did, that he would come out and resign. But yeah, he didn't. What did he do instead?
So the news from number 10 was that Friday was going to be another big relaunch. You'd have Zahawi out there. Like they'd already got their big economic plan that Boris really wanted to make this week about. So he was going to go out and talk economics. But instead, what you got was silence from number 10 and a few more resignations. So Michelle Donlan, the Education Secretary, appointed merely 24 hours before, goes in the morning. The Welsh Cabinet Secretary goes as well. The Northern Ireland Secretary starts to go. These were, again, big cabinet positions, all leaving, and more trickle of your PPSs. It goes up to about 55, 60 in the end. It's quite a big number. And I decided to listen to BBC Radio 4 at the time while I worked. And Nick Robinson said the most prescient thing, I think, that just really clicked for me. He said, the Today programme was extended by an hour because they said the one big problem is that number 10, we've got absolute silence. They are not picking up the media's calls. They are not telling us anything. And when you get silence, that's usually the sign that everybody is hunkered down and they've made the decision to give up and resign, because otherwise he would be spouting, like, you would give an all clear message, you'd let everybody know everything's okay and try and put forward a plan to the media. That silence and indecision basically said that the game was up. And from about 8-9 o'clock we got the news that Boris Johnson was to resign as Prime Minister. So everybody on certain elements of politics started to rejoice. Goodness me, thank goodness that's over. But as we've said, So in between then and his resignation speech, there were a few questions that came up, and we've touched on it before. One being, how long should he stay in government for as Prime Minister? Because usually you get a time period. They resign as Prime Minister, but they stay as Prime Minister for a little bit until another one can be appointed. And if he had resigned on the Wednesday night or Thursday morning, if he called off PMQs or something like that and said, no, I'm not going to do this, I'm going to resign, he would have lost 2 major cabinet ministers and a couple of personal private secretaries, right? But the government could still function and go on. Instead, he'd dragged it on so long that 60 people had left and he needed 60 people to fill those roles. And the amount of the Conservative Party that was against him, it seemed unlikely that anybody would answer that call. There was a Welsh private secretary who hadn't resigned, who apparently Boris Johnson called up and offered them the cabinet position, and they turned it down, said, no, thank you, I don't want to serve in your cabinet, which is really bad when you've got people turning you down to your face. The BBC ran polling saying that if a vote of no confidence was taken in the Prime Minister within the Conservative Party, they thought the Prime Minister would be expected to pick up 65 votes amongst MPs. And when you've got an intake of about 360 Conservative MPs, that's astonishing that you've got nearly 300 MPs willing to vote against you when you're the leader of your party. So, yeah, those questions start to come out and said, what is Boris Johnson actually going to do? Is he going to stay around till the autumn? Do the Conservative Party want this? Instead, we got a promise that Boris Johnson would step down as leader of the Conservative Party, which he delivered in a speech at 12:30 on Friday. I don't know if I assume that you watched the speech in some respect. And I've seen quite a few prime ministerial resignations throughout the years. We're in quite a turbulent time for British politics. Where we've seen, most conservative prime ministers, Cameron, May, and now Johnson, have all left office in between terms rather than being taken out after an election, which is unique in itself. I found the speech underwhelming. I don't know about you, but it was unlike any other speech. Like, most of them tend to say, like, oh, it's been a great privilege to serve my country. This is very clear that I am resigning and leaving office, and these are the reasons why I have failed you, but I am proud of these achievements. Boris Johnson kind of just to say, I would like to stay on, but the herd changed its mind, and once it changed its mind, it's really hard to take it back, even though I don't really agree with them. It was the best job in the world, but them's the breaks. As I stole this off Richard Osmond, but the best thing that summed it up was he said that speech was Churchillian in the way that it made me want to buy car insurance. It's just, a very Boris speech, not grandiose, and as people mentioned afterwards, he didn't mention the word resign once. It could have been, it felt just like a normal Boris speech, and if you hadn't been told he was resigning, you could have missed it, because he barely seemed to want to apologise for the bad stuff he'd done. It was kind of like, I'll leave when a new Prime Minister's appointed, I guess. Bye. What was your whole opinion on the thing? Because I found that a very bizarre element from yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, the speech, like you say, those speeches are often conciliatory, apologetic, and being like trying to establish your legacy. And I mean, it was none of those. It was a very odd speech. We'd all been waiting for it. Like you said, glued to BBC News 24, I'd pulled out my iPad at work and we just had it on. Actually, I have a photo that I'll put in the chat of there's a bit where me and my friends were all like, this is our view of as we, watch the government collapse, which was quite fun. Just like me at the hospital, with an MRI, the MRI scanner. And it's interesting, actually, we've just had a question from the chat about how Trumpian that speech was, and do you think he'll try and storm number 10? And it's interesting because we talk about this as if this is a big constitutional crisis, etc., and Americans who've been like happy to not be the main cause of news for once and have been happily watching our weird story over here, the impression I get is that a lot of Americans don't consider this at all the same, because they're like, well, basically he lied about some cake is their understanding of it. So yeah, it's like it is on a different level to the kind of Trump, encouraging people to storm the Senate. And yeah, I mean, we're going to talk about what happens next for the Conservative Party in a second, but like Boris has said, he wants to stay there until, as interim prime minister, until his replacement is selected, and that's a normal thing. That's not a surprise. Obviously sometimes there's someone obvious waiting in the wings, but the Conservatives need to pick someone to replace him. And he said, well, I'll carry on as Prime Minister. He's got like a cabinet now, so they can get on with business. He doesn't have all those PPSs, as you said, but enough that they can get on with the kind of limited set of things a caretaker Prime Minister would be expected to do. But he's saying he's going to stay until like October, because that's when the next Conservative conference is. And everyone was like, that's very weird. And then you may, if you'd been paying attention when I listed all the headlines earlier, realise that he wants to stay on for one more party. So the kind of bombshell news that fell yesterday, I'm like, why is he hanging around? Like, you're gone, mate. You've resigned. It's very strange. It turns out that because he and Carrie Johnson got married during COVID, they had arranged to have a wedding bash at Chequers, which is the country estate of the Prime Minister, which obviously you have to be Prime Minister to use. And that's happening at the end of the month. So they'd already sent out invitations for this. And so the current theory is that the reason he wants to stay on is just like, it's not about legacy or anything, because, he's kind of shot that in the foot. But what he wants to do is just use Chequers on the taxpayer's dime, which is ridiculous. That's my opinion on it. I don't know. don't know anyone else going, oh, that seems very sensible, Boris. What is he doing?
So it was telling in the speech he thanked the staff at Chequers before he thanked the staff at Number 10, which made some people think like, oh, that's where his head is. He preferred to swan it up at Chequers, which is the nice fancy place, rather than slum it in Number 10. There are stories today, apparently, that Johnson has now found an alternative private venue to host that party. So either he's actually listening to other people saying like, hey, this is bad optics. If you do this, he's very much, I think he'll be leading as a caretaker prime minister at the whim of the Conservative Party, who don't want him to do anything embarrassing in that time as prime minister, as caretaker prime minister. If he does, they are in a very strong position. Like I said, they can just go for a vote of no confidence in him. They can spark that really quickly on Monday if they wanted and say, no, actually, mate, your time's up. We don't want you as a caretaker prime minister. We'll kick you out before then, and Dominic Raab can take over, or what member of the cabinet wants to be caretaker prime minister in the meantime. Like, they've still got those options available to them. They think he wanted to make it through to the Conservative Party conference, but the news is that the Conservative Party itself wants this process to go very quickly, have the elections over the summer recess, and be ready back in time for the start of September rather than it running into October. So I think that's where we're at. Like, Johnson is still in charge, and he has made more ministerial appointments yesterday and today. One of the more notable ones is, I don't know if you know about Peter Bone. The old speaker, John Bercow, used to say Peter Bone, and it was one of the more recognisable names. He's like a Johnson loyalist to the core and appeared on Newsnight defending Johnson on Thursday night. Like, that's how he's in Nadine Dorris, Jacob Rees-Mogg levels of I've pinned my colours to the mast and I will bleed Boris Johnson. He's been appointed a minister, and he appears somebody who very much acts on loyalty rather than any level of competence, I would say. And some people have said that those type of appointments, if that's the bottom of the barrel that Boris is scraping to try and fill his interim government, the Conservative Party might get quite annoyed with that quite soon and feel that it's not full of people competent enough even to carry on a caretaker government when you've got things like Ukraine and a cost of living crisis going on at the same time. You need some sort of functioning democracy. So yes, how long Johnson will actually stay, if he stays until the end of October or reaches the party conference, I think at this stage is very unlikely. And it is clear that he will leave. It's just a question of how quickly the Conservative Party kick him out. And I think Boris Johnson, even though publicly he's not saying it, and again, that's he's always acted as if everything's fine now. Like, I think he's still acting like, okay, that's sorted. I'll just pretend to be caretaker prime minister and enjoy that for the time being. It's very, very clear to me that he now governs at the whim of the Conservative Party, and I think they'll make it very clear that, we can remove you at a moment's notice. The next scandal that comes along, you're gone, mate. You can't afford another mistake.
Yeah, no, I think, I mean, that's what I hope for, but Boris has a way of sticking around, and after he said, I was like, what are you on? That you can think, and there's been lots of comments in the most recent days about whether he, whether he's been so kept away from everything in Number 10 that he actually doesn't really understand this stuff. But also, I don't think he's an idiot. I think he plays a bumbling buffoon, and we've talked about this before. He's clearly very shrewd to have got to be prime minister in the first place. So yeah, it's this weird thing where it's like, I feel like he's trying to break the rules on purpose because that's what he likes to do. He thinks he should be, there was I think Joe.com, which does a lot of kind of, it was led by donkeys, posted a video a few years back when Boris came to power, showing all of the terrible things he'd done, the lies he'd had. Like when he was mayor of London, he said 17 times in one year that he would not run to be an MP again, and then the next year ran to be an MP while mayor of London, and things like that, and all sorts of other stuff. But apparently his first desire as a child was to be world king. So yeah, that's the kind of person we're dealing with. So we mentioned, where we're going next. So Conservative Party needs a new leader, and that leader would become prime minister because, for the listeners who don't know, that's how it works. The majority party's leader, as long as enough of the majority party have faith in them, they can form a government. They just go to the Queen, hey, I've got an 80-seat majority. We're going to be government now, with the new leader who just becomes prime minister because they're the head of the party. So there is a list of people who might replace him. So do you want to do kind of a quick run through?
I'll do a very quick down of the possible candidates that the BBC have got lined up for us. There's quite a few, and this could be the problem for the Conservatives, is that they've got rid of Boris, and when they've got rid of leaders in the past, there's been quite a clear policy split. Like when Theresa May went, it was clear that her Brexit wasn't working and that there were people who were making plans in the background to put forward their view of how they would run things without Brexit. Boris Johnson's departure, I think, has been quicker and more unexpected than people thought. So the Conservative Party doesn't really have any great policy people behind them. Like, there's not these clear groups as there once were when Boris got elected. It was clear that there was like a Boris wing of the party and probably a Jeremy Hunt wing of the party. Now you've got all these tiny groups and all these leadership candidates who are scrambling for attention and trying to get into the first round of the ballot. So that's maybe why the Conservatives are worrying that it could be quite an extended contest, because they've got to get through many rounds before they get to the final two. But of the main candidates, you've got Rishi Sunak, former Chancellor of the Exchequer, would have been the front runner, I think, if you'd run this 6 months ago. But as we mentioned in our previous episode that actually came out on this channel, he hasn't had the easiest of times. He has officially launched his campaign today. As some people have noticed online, his website was, the domain was bought back in December 2021. So if you're wondering when he's had this little idea on his mind, it's been for a while, and while he was still Chancellor of the Exchequer. So, he's at least a recognisable name to the public. People will know him for better or for worse, so that I think that might put him in a slightly stronger position than some of the others we're going to talk about. You've got Liz Truss, who I think is yet to formally announce her competition, but again, she's a fairly recognisable name. Cabinet Minister, Foreign Secretary, known for her delivering a bizarre speech at the Conservative Party conference a few years ago when she talks about cheese and pork markets. In my opinion, she would be a disaster for the Conservative Party. I think in my mind, she's like Theresa May, but less charismatic, which sounds awful because it is awful.
I mean, I'm just going to throw in here, we're going to go through the list. The two people on this list, like, we often to comment when the Conservatives are picking a new leader, it's, the best of a bad bunch, But out of these, the two I definitely wouldn't want in charge are Liz Truss, because I just don't think she's competent at all. And I don't think she's playing it in a Boris kind of bumbling way. I think she just regularly makes stupid mistakes. And then Priti Patel, because just the stuff she's been trying to get through, I don't want her in charge. I like the immigration policy, all of that, which I think I said about Theresa May at the time, and Theresa May obviously then had to deal with Brexit, so I guess that kind of got pushed under the rug. But no, I don't think Priti Patel should be in charge, because I don't have anything nice to say about those two, really. The others, there's a whole load of them I probably don't want. I mean, I don't want any of them in reality, but out of the selection, I might have one or two where I go, oh, well, I don't know anything bad about them particularly. I'm sure there probably is some scandal waiting in the wings because it's the Conservative Party. But yeah. Anyway, I'll let you get back on to this.
That's all right. You've got Nadeem Zahawi, who again is another. He was came from Iraq here when he was 4 years old, didn't speak a word of English, made his way up to be the Chancellor of the Exchequer, even if it is for just a very short period of time. He's certainly not short of ambition, and he has that story behind him. But again, I don't know if his machinations in the last few days will work in his favour. He's certainly somebody who seems to be playing all sides, as it seems. Next, you've got Jeremy Hunt. Again, a recognisable name if you followed politics for a while. The only problem with Jeremy Hunt running again this time is that he ran against Boris Johnson and lost. I don't know what's changed in that time to make him think that he could win. One thing that might go in his favour, and we'll talk about these with other candidates that are coming up, is that some within the Conservative Party will feel that we've had the Boris Johnson party for a while, right? We've had a very strong figure at the start, and he's all bravado and being very brash, but look where that got us. That got us mired in scandal very quickly, and within 2 to 3 years, we'd sort of lost a clear legislative agenda. The thing that people were crying from within the Conservative Party, another reason why they lost faith with Johnson, is they felt that the policies being implemented weren't necessarily following any great Conservative traditions. They were more there just because Boris Johnson thought they were popular and would keep him in the job a couple of extra months. So Hunt coming along with I'm a moderate, I'm a one nation Conservative, I will abandon the divisive politics of Boris and the populism and try and unite the country might be an appealing vision, but the fact that he's lost in the past, I think, work. against him. Suella Braverman, who is the Attorney General, she's quite interesting in the fact that she's one of they call them the Spartans. She was one of the people who every bit of Theresa May Brexit legislation that came up, she always voted against it. Even Boris Johnson, right at the end, voted for Theresa May's deal to try and get it through Parliament. Suella Braverman never budged and always made sure that it would fail. So, and even on her speech to Peston on Thursday night, she was talking about how she was going to get rid of woke politics and these liberal lefties. So that's her type of, she's a bit more Johnsonian in the way that she speaks, and she's a bit more culture warsy. So I don't know if people want to go for that again. Certainly doesn't seem that appealing. Penny Mordaunt, I'm afraid I don't know much about.
She was Defence Secretary. And it's interesting because every time they show her like file photo, I don't recognize her, because like the photo of her that's quite famous is her looking quite stern, I think. And it's like I'll try and find the image that I consider famous of her. But actually, I mean, there's actually a lot of photos of her, but there's a photo of her with like the UK flag behind her where she looks very kind of stern. And she was in the military, I believe. And there's like an older article from The Mirror, which isn't loading for some reason, that talks about her. But yeah, so yeah, not a massive amount of info, I don't think.
According to there's the BBC article I've got here has also got a YouGov poll of potential Conservative Party members. She is ranked fairly highly on that list, so clearly she's quite well regarded by the party faithful, which is really, you need to appeal to two groups to try and become Prime Minister or win the Conservative election. You need to first have support of more than 50% of your MPs in that final round to get to the final two, and then you have to win the support of the wider membership. So if she's doing something right there, that's good. But looking at this, the problem when you have like 10 to 15 candidates is that it's clear amongst this poll is that like the highest person has 13%. A lot can change in that time. If you're only polling at 13%, then a lot of people can switch their allegiances to somebody else as more people drop out of the competition. So that's very sub.
None of the above is 12%. So Penny Mordaunt is currently ranked the same as I don't like any of them. So yeah, that obviously can move around and change things.
Ken, you've got Tom Tugendhat, who
sounds like he's from Thomas the Tank Engine. Yep.
Another he was a former territorial army officer. The best joke I saw about him today, it says that he's thrown his hat in the ring, so of course now he'll be known as just Tom Tugen. He announced.
That's bad. I'll just be over here, not really laughing at that.
I'm glad you. I'm glad you let the silence linger there, because it really, did undermine the entire joke. No, he announced his candidacy in a Telegraph opinion piece this morning. It just kind of said like, "This is me, and this is why I want to be leader of the Conservative Party." And there's a lot of people who are doing that now. I think we're going to see quite a busy race for the leader. There's a lot of mayor in here, and there's going to be a lot of mayor, I feel, within the Conservative Party race, and it's something that will be very, very, very interesting to see where it develops. I feel that the overall theme of the race, so we've talked about like Boris Johnson leaving. What Boris Johnson wants to kind of do is sort of what we've talked about Boris Johnson being Trumpian, and there is this feeling that when Trump lost the election, Trump wants a few years in the wilderness, but he wants to be the Republican Party candidate next time around. You know, like, oh, you can't get rid of me. I'll run again. You'll realize how much you missed me and you'll vote for me again. I feel like Boris is like, okay, I won't be on this ballot, but maybe on the next one, I want somebody that's so bad that you'll have to come running back to me. So I feel that this fight for the Conservative Party's soul will be them either looking like, do we go for a Steve Baker? Do we double down on what Boris did, like policy-wise, where he was quite culture warsy and quite divisive and fairly hard Brexit, and go for that strategy? Because do we feel that was part of Boris's appeal and that's why we got so many votes in 2019? Or do they go for a Jeremy Hunt or a Sajid Javid, who are saying that like, no, what we need at this time is a one nation Conservative, somebody who does away with all that culture war stuff, brings the party back together, that way that we can bring back all those people who left us because Boris Johnson was making the party so toxic. And that is where you get the fight between, if you want to get those in the red wall on side, like that famous red wall, that's where we took votes from Labour up in the north, you would go for a more Stephen Baker figure. However, if you want to win those voters back that you are losing in Cornwall, the ones you're losing to the Lib Dems, I think that's where you go for a more one nation conservative approach, because now Boris Johnson's not in charge. I think some of those people who voted Lib Dem might be willing to go back to the Conservatives, because I think a lot of those people were staying away just because Boris Johnson's personality and his morals were keeping them away from the party. They would be naturally, those areas of the country tend to be naturally like more conservative in their beliefs, but also kind of more like, it's the same as, it's similar to what happened in America with, though there were more, Trump was picking up more working class voters, what you would consider more working class over there, and was losing the college educated middle class people who would have voted Republican in the past but couldn't stomach Trump, so decided to switch to Democrat. You've got a similar thing, I think, between the Conservatives and Lib Dems, particularly in the Southwest. So and that has been a real, electorally for the Conservatives, I do think the threat from the Lib Dems in the Southwest is of a particular concern to many MPs who felt their seats were safe and now they're not. You could lose Dominic Raab, for example. I think one of his constituencies was one of the ones the Lib Dems said, hey, if we get half the swing that we got in the last election down in Cornwall, if we repeated that, we would get rid of Raab, they'd get rid of Doris, they'd get rid of their few people. So yeah.
So just on that note, Raab, I was literally talking with people in Raab's constituency last night, so here's some hot off the presses reporting. But yeah, I haven't spoken to anyone in his constituency who likes Raab. Now, that may be the people I hang out with, but yes, it's the one next to Ed Davies' constituency, which I'm in. So it would not surprise me, like, as you have Richmond go and then Kingston go Lib Dem, it would not surprise me if Isha and out there also could go Lib Dem again. Apparently, this is a thing that was mentioned last night. He rocked up to there was a fun run kind of event, and someone was saying, oh yeah, I saw him recently. He was down there presenting the prizes, and apparently he just told them he was coming. Like, he wasn't invited. He was just like, needs a photo op. So he was just like, I'm coming to this, by the way. And yeah, apparently he's also been trying to get his children into one of the fairly selective local schools, and doesn't understand that's not how it works. No amount of schmoozing allows your children to pass the entrance exam. So yeah, just some Dominic Raab facts there. I just can't. Yeah, like he has done some stuff locally that people, and that's always the interesting thing. We see him. I remember Raab as the person who said, it turns out we are particularly reliant on the Dover-Calais crossing, which is just such an inane and stupid thing to say that was in the intro to Brexit cast for like 6 months or something because it was so stupid. But then on the flip side, he's apparently very pro helping out with the green belt and stuff. So there's a bit of green belt people want to build on out here, and he's like, no, we'll oppose it. In a kind of, as you say, kind of a traditional conservative values way. Like, no, we must protect the countryside and the stuff we have. And so there definitely will be a group of people who support him for that. But it does sound, well, based on my small sample, I wouldn't be surprised if he is a bit on the ropes when it comes to a general election.
Oh, totally. And I think that's the big question going for Conservatives moving forward. And like Boris Johnson's legacy, you've got the Mail, you've got people like the Mail today and the Express saying, oh my goodness, what have they done? Getting rid of Boris spells certain electoral defeat, right? If you had Boris Johnson, you had a chance. And I would argue quite strongly against that. The reason that they were getting rid of Boris Johnson was because they were losing by-elections they never should have lost. Like, parties in midterms do lose by-elections, but the seats they were losing were some of the safest of the safe Conservative seats, and they were losing them to the Lib Dems. And there was a real worry that that you would see that again if he called a general election. Like, there was for a time some people wondering, like, is Boris Johnson going to call in a general election to try and get himself out of that? And part of me thinks that would have been the worst gamble to take, because even though he is a good campaigner, I start to feel that most people felt that had rubbed off. And if people were very much voting in those by-elections on the lines of how do we get rid of Boris Johnson, I feel. And what those headlines tend to forget is, like, because I think the Mail is trying to deliberately hark back to an Express headline that apparently was doing the rounds amongst loyalist Boris MPs and trying to convince other MPs. Before he went on Friday, there was one with Margaret Thatcher, and the Express just said, what on earth have they done? Why have they got rid of Margaret Thatcher back in the 90s? I would remind those Conservatives that they got rid of her because she was incredibly unpopular about the poll tax. They replaced her with John Major, who was a fairly middling, boring, everything that Thatcher wasn't MP, and they won the next election. They scraped by, but they did win, and they stayed in power for another 5 years because of that change. I don't think they would have won in 1992 if they had Thatcher in charge. So that is the electoral calculus. That's the decision that the Conservative Party is making because of Boris Johnson, and they've now got a real task to try and change the image of that party, to try and detoxify the Conservative brand, because I do feel that particularly after Partygate, particularly after this Pincher affair, with all of these scandals that have been going on, the Conservative Party is getting back to having that view of that 90s sleaze about them. And it's brand Conservative is not a great brand amongst the general public at the moment. And even though the polls are showing that they are going down because of Boris Johnson, it's hard to tell if the polls are going down because people don't vote for divided parties, or if, everybody who was a Boris supporter has now left that ship and that's instantly lost them 5% of all voters who are suddenly homeless or want to go to UKIP or want to go to Reclaim or whatever. I don't know. But maybe we'll get onto the polls later. But the next leader really does face a challenge to try and, say what the Conservative Party stands for again, because when we are talking about the legacy of Boris Johnson and what he's done in his time in charge, a lot of the political obituaries for him were saying, yeah, he got Brexit done. Okay, that's what he was voted in to do in 2019. He broke a political deadlock that clearly wasn't working under Theresa May. And he was able to sort that constitutional crisis that could have happened at the time and moved the country on from the years of debate that it had on Brexit ever since David Cameron resigned, ever since 2016. The function of government didn't seem to move on because we couldn't get past Brexit. He got that sorted. But ever since then, and I know that it was a premiership also defined by the COVID pandemic, because it appeared that he got in, and then the pandemic happened, and he never really was able to implement the plan that was in his manifesto because of the impact of COVID. Despite that, he doesn't seem to have achieved much. I think if you ask somebody what was Boris Johnson's economic vision, what was his actual vision for the country beyond getting Brexit done, very hard to define. Levelling up, maybe, but he didn't seem to make any great inroads into that. His economic policy was inconsistent. He talked a big game on low tax, but actually increased taxation to one of the biggest levels since post-war. That confused messaging, and many Conservatives being quite annoyed that he wasn't implementing what they saw as Conservative policies, leaves the next leader with a big question mark of, what do we actually stand for? Can I rebrand the Conservative Party as a proper Conservative Party of government? Will I lead it like one of those of old? I think that's what many of them will try and do, because that was something that was really big and missing from Johnson, who tended to focus more on culture warsy stuff. A great campaigner, not a great leader or prime minister in the sense of getting things done, and I think that's fair to say.
Yeah. We have a question from the chat, which I think probably better puts kind of things I was trying to suggest. So, due to the amount of sleaze and scandal over the past 3 to 12 years, do you see a Conservative Party as it is now being around in 10 years' time? Do you see it splitting down the middle? And this is related specifically to the optics of younger generations, as generally older voters vote Tory and they're slowly dying off. There's more. There is actually, I think we've discussed before, there's a political effect where there's a load of, there's a wave of people coming through about 5 to 10 years younger than us, I think, of young people who are quite politically active, who've lived through some fairly rubbish times, which may affect, the voting. They're the ones who've just kind of turned 18 recently. So if there was a general election, that would may affect the general, voting intention of the public. So yeah, what do you think about that, Rob? Is the Conservative Party going away?
I think that the Conservative Party has been incredibly resilient for the majority of its premiership. I don't see it splitting. If it was going to split at any point, it would have been back in the 90s when it was incredibly split over Europe, or maybe under Theresa May, when part of that crisis you had back in 2019 is that she had a mix of Remainer Conservatives and Brexity Conservatives, and that was the reason her deal wasn't getting through. She had a very small majority and she couldn't convince both sides of the party that they could go through. Now that's resolved, the Conservative Party seems relatively united. I mean, it has united now behind the fact that they don't like Boris Johnson very much. If the party was to split on the views of its MPs, at least you might end up with 60 MPs splitting off to form the Boris Johnson party, where the other 300 would stay around. Now, you could argue that maybe those group of 60 MPs might think that their vision for Britain is actually far more electorally successful. But it does tend to be the case that people don't vote for divided parties. The Conservatives are usually quite pragmatic and quite intelligent at getting, at making sure they can get a party people want to vote for. So I don't see it splitting. I do think it might be the start of, obviously we've had, how many years of Conservative government is it now? 10?
12,
they come 12? In 12 years of Conservative.
2010 they came in.
Yeah.
With the coalition.
So you've had roughly 12 years of Conservative government. The Labour government lasted from 97 till 2010. So what's that? So that's 13 years. You tend to get to the end of a natural cycle where people generally do feel that it is time for a change, and we could see the Conservatives in the doldrums again, as they were for that period in the late 90s and early 2000s. So I think that is they've got to that stage where they've just got so much electoral baggage. They can't keep blaming the current effects on the Labour Party, which is what you always do when you come in. You say, oh, weren't that last lot rubbish? We've got to change things. A lot of these Conservative candidates, has been observed, like Rishi Sunak, apparently part of his campaign says, oh, I really want to sort out the economy if I get elected leader, which some people are saying, mate, you've been in charge of the economy. That was your
job.
Yeah, literally your job. Like, what are you going to say? The last bloke was doing a rubbish job, elect me. It's the same person. That's where their arguments start to really fall down, and the general public isn't stupid. They do see that. So yes, I don't think it's going to die a death. I think you will always get some brand of Conservatives through. You mentioned that, yes, younger generations do tend to be more left-leaning and politically active. I do believe that they were particularly sort of engaged by the politics of Corbyn. I don't think Keir has been able to get quite the same level of enthusiasm behind him, certainly. But you've also got, there are people 5 years younger than me that I've observed that are also they're quite Brexity. They're quite anti both political, anti-Labour in a sense. They enjoyed the anti-wokeness of Boris Johnson's party and some of that culture wars thing. There is that, it's the same way as, I keep comparing it to America, so apologies, but Trump was able to invigorate a weird level of right-wing youth and embolden them to come out. And you wouldn't necessarily say that the majority of America's youth is particularly right-wing, but the ones he gets involved are quite engaged and are quite active and quite loud, and that keeps the party going and keeps them having energy. So I don't think that it's just inevitable the Conservative Party will die out as more people get older and the OAPs, and it just fades into the distance. There will always be a space on the right of politics, and maybe the danger is that if the Conservative Party was to die out completely, the party that would rise in its place, you're seeing it across Europe now, you might get something like the National Front, Le Pen in France. The Conservatives, the traditional Conservative Party has gone away in France, but has been replaced by Le Pen, somebody who's arguably much further to the right in politics. So I would just say that would be a case of be careful what you wish for. Yeah, summary of that. Very long answer to that question.
I just wanted to add, like you said, the Conservative Party is, I think, the longest running single political party in the world. They know a thing or two about staying together as a party over all else. And we saw that. I think the closest we've ever got to a potential split was over Brexit. When Theresa May was there, and we saw what happened. They got rid of their leader and they sorted things. So I think, their first and foremost, well, other than to themselves, their first and foremost thing they care about is the party. So yeah, I think that's very much what happened. Not surprised. It wouldn't surprise me to see the Conservative Party continuing on. It's very good at reinventing itself, and people continue to fall for it. I don't know why, but yeah. Anyway, I think that's kind of got us to the end, except for the polls. So let's just have a look at where the polls stand. So our link that we've been using to look at the we have two. We have the electoral calculus and we have the Politico poll of polls. And I think the poll of polls is going to be the most up to date, but it's not necessarily going to capture what happened in the last few days. Oh, I say that. That's interesting. Okay, so let's have a look first at the electoral calculus prediction. So this came out on the 1st of July, so before all of this happened. And their current prediction was Labour short 16 of a majority. So there's only a 10% chance of a Conservative majority overall. And they're currently predicting the predicted seats, the Conservatives will get 247 and Labour 310. So Labour would have a minority government, which still seems slightly wild given everything that's going on. But obviously, this is a snapshot they do on the first of every month, so that's missing a week of news. But obviously, if a general election was held tomorrow, the polls may be different anyway. And then if we go over to the Politico poll of polls, you will see, and we're just starting to see near the end, a surge in the Lib Dems in the last few days, which is pushing down the Conservative percentage, and a slight shift to Labour as well. So that puts Labour 10% ahead. So the other day when I checked this, it was 7%. And when Boris was claiming in his speech, we're still only we still have a slight lead in the polls, he was obviously not telling the truth. Surprise, surprise. But now it's a 10% lead for Labour. So it would be very interesting if we had a general election today. Might actually give us a Labour majority because first past the post is a silly system. Do you have anything else to add on that, Rob?
Yeah, I think just that obviously the polls are looking good for Labour at the moment. Where the real challenge comes for Labour now is without Boris Johnson as leader, they do have to start getting their act together and have some clear sort of policies and goals. And Keir Starmer has to assume that he is now the front runner to be the next prime minister or be one of the leading candidates for there. So he has to put forward a realistic plan for governance. All I think that he's been able to rely on in the past is, I'm not Boris Johnson. I don't lie like Boris Johnson. I've clearly got better integrity than Boris Johnson. And that I think that has been key to his appeal, that people will look at the two candidates, look at who might be prime minister and say, well, I don't think Keir's particularly inspiring, but he's not Boris Johnson, so I'll vote for Keir. Now we'll have to come up against somebody completely different who might not, voters might say, oh, okay, yeah, no, Javid has integrity, I guess. Oh, okay, now I've got a bit more of a decision to make. He needs to make now a clear policy goal for the Labour Party and make sure that he can capture those voters and keep them on side rather than just rely on people not thinking that Boris Johnson is very popular, because I do think Boris Johnson's unpopularity towards the end was a big factor in Labour going up in the polls rather than anything great they had done. The news today has come out from the Durham Constabulary that Keir Starmer is not going to be fined or prosecuted for that curry that he had during COVID, which Labour will generally see as good news. I think that's why they're now pushing for a vote of no confidence. Now they know who their leader would be going into election. Now they know that that's sorted out. There's not that big question mark over will Keir Starmer be leader of the party or will he have to resign. It's clear that he's the one in place for the time being. They've got to put everything behind him, so I think that might spur them on as well to get a programme of government out there and for them to be there was a time under John Major's government, when you compared it to Blair, there was a time where everybody knew the Conservatives are lagging behind in the polls. There's no way they're going to win this 97 election. Every time Tony Blair got up and made a statement in the House of Commons or did PMQs, people saw it as, this is what Britain's going to look like. This is the next prime minister. Keir Starmer has to kind of get to that level of authority, because at the moment, all he's been able to do is kind of be opposition to Boris Johnson, and that's it. And people don't really know what he stands for. Yeah, he has to make that vision for Britain pretty clear. Otherwise, if he doesn't, then he's going to face a real challenge from the next Conservative leader, and the next election could be quite close.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that is part of the problem. I think Keir Starmer often gets maligned for some reasons that may not be fully correct. But yes, he's not good at presenting this is why you should vote for me, even when he's calling on Boris Johnson to resign and stuff like that. Because I think a lot of people have been like, you should have called him to resign earlier. And he finally did it. And then equally, there will presumably be a call. Well, I mean, Labour are saying they will go for a vote of no confidence, but you kind of, at this point, his hands are tied. He basically has to put that to the House, even though it won't go through. The Conservatives wouldn't vote themselves out of power as a party, but he has to put it on the table so that when people say, oh, well, what did you do about Boris? He can say, well, I went for a vote of no confidence. Yeah, he's kind of in that very reactive position. But yeah, so yeah, thank you, Rob, as always, for joining me and filling me in on the news and everything. You can find us in all the usual places. You can find us on our website at parliamentary.observer. You can find us on Facebook as Unparliamentary Language. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram at Unparl Podcast, and you can find us on Reddit at /r/unparliamentary. Come and join in the conversation. And of course, as I mentioned earlier in the show, we have a Discord. You can come here and be here when we record. We generally do like a live show, as it were, when something big has happened. But if you see us in the recording channel, you can just jump in while we're recording and listen along as it's live. Hear the full show unedited. I know some people are into listening to unedited shows. We don't release like a full unedited version. That's the only way you can kind of hear all the various gaffes that we have trying to record. Yeah, I guess there's nothing else left for me to say other than it's good night from me.
And it's good night from him. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Boris. Don't make me cry. Bye, bye, Boris. Bye.
Join Mike and Tom for nerdy conversation with a multitude of guests on Hat of Many Things.
Say hi, guys.
Hi, guys.
Hello.
I'm Mark, a librarian and professional wrestling ring announcer.
I cast League of Legends.
Soteros Philbricato, best known for my work with White Wolf and Onyx Path Publishing on the World of Darkness.
Hi, I'm Jason Carl. I'm the producer of V5 at White Wolf.
Yeah, my name is Johanna Pettersson. I'm a Finnish game designer.